Good day, everyone! London Onion here at long last with our first Invader Prime build, receiving an Onion approval for the Apocalypse difficulty. Now, I'm pretty sure this is a popular pairing, and we have done the reverse in the past, but our accompanying archetype today is the Hunter. These two are a match made in heaven with their skills. Their practical combat patterns complement each other almost perfectly. The Invader specializes in enemy misdirection and evasion, namely through their decoys and threat reduction. The Hunter is more stick in that they specialize in ranged burst damage with weak spot hits, emphasis on range damage. The Hunter specializes in ending skirmishes from a distance and or before they begin. This is achieved through enhanced vision and elusiveness. Their archetype traits are naturally complementary. Both value their personal space, though the Invader will have an easier time with evasion, while the Hunter's trait predisposes them to a greater margin of ranged efficacy. With all of this stated, we'll transition to the build. So this Onion does not have a prescriptive armor set. However, our demonstrations will be with the Fey Royal armor set. Maximizing armor effectiveness without going into Ultra is the main point, so armor is a preferential choice. The relic I employ is the Diverting Heart, which reduces skill cooldowns by 15 seconds over the course of 15 seconds. The shards I equip are armor effectiveness, consumable use speed, and skill cooldown. Our primary weapon is the Royal Hunting Bow with Familiar and the Supercharger Mutator. The secondary is preferential, but I equip the Tech 22 with Scrapshot and the Bandit Mutator. The melee weapon is also preferential, but I decided to rock the Dreamcatcher Staff and Shielded Strike. Moving on to the creative side of the build, there is a fair amount of versatility with this pairing, but the amulet leading today's build is the Difference Engine. While a shield is active, all damage is increased by 20%, and 4.5% of base damage is returned as lifesteal. As for the rings, I employ Tightly Wound Coil, Assassin's Seal, Celerity Stone, and Generating Band. Tightly Wound Coil grants a 15% shield for 5 seconds upon expending 75% or more of the equipped weapon's magazine. Assassin's Seal reduces enemy awareness range by 25% and increases all damage dealt to enemies that are not targeting the wearer by 10%. Depending on one's choice of the primary weapon, this Onion would consider the Blessed Ring to be a fair alternative for 2 stacks of Bulwark for 30 seconds upon using a relic. Celerity Stone increases consumable and relic use speed by 25%. Lastly, Generating Band regenerates 3% of one's max health per second while a shield is active. As for the traits and skills, I take the Engineer's Fortify, Vigor, Endurance, Spirit, Expertise, Bark Skin, Footwork, Recovery, and Siphoner. Now the skills are integral for the Invader. I employ Reboot, which creates a magical data backup of one's current health, stamina, relic charges, ammo, and negative status effects for 30 seconds. During this time, movement speed is increased by 15% and damage reduction by 10%. Upon reactivating the skill, all previous values will be restored and a decoy spawned for 3 seconds. On the Hunter side, I go with the Hunter's Shroud, which cloaks the Hunter but does not necessarily make them invisible. Enemy awareness is reduced by an undefined value, but if they are already aware of one's presence, then at most, enemies will attack where you are as opposed to where you will be, making one, in theory, more difficult to hit. Homing shots from enemies, for example, will travel in the direction of the user, but will not have a homing effect. Attacking, consuming, or activating a mod/skill will exit Shroud. Exiting Shroud will highlight all enemies within 10 meters and grant a 50% ranged/melee damage buff for 2 seconds and increase critical chance by 10%. After exactly 1.15 seconds of non-offensive activity, one will return to Shroud. With our build ascertained, we will transition to the application and limitations. Alright, so the main meta guiding this build is a strategical and economical use of one's skills and relics to maximize enemy misdirection, minimize enemy contact, and buff damage output as consistently as possible. This is part of the rationale for selecting a bow as our primary weapon. They are completely silent, and will consequently allow one to get the initial drop on their enemies. Technically, the Widowmaker is a viable option for increased burst damage, but will significantly reduce the amount of opportunities for an unseen strike against unwitting targets. If this is the case, then this onion would recommend the Blessed Ring as an alternative to the Assassin's Seal. Additionally, the bow, which can only have a magazine of 1, will activate Tightly Wound Coil with ease, which will in turn activate the leading amulet for damage boost, lifesteal opportunities, and regenerated health from generating band. The Tech 22 was intended to serve a similar purpose with how quickly one can expend a magazine, but for balance, using the bow puts additional stress of accuracy per target compared to automatic weapons, and so it is nice to have a quote-unquote stress-free secondary that can also activate the amulet and rings. Now this onion went with heavier armor for the increased armor effectiveness. Even though lighter armor would make enemy evasion far easier, I did not want to create a glass cannon for a build, as this onion is, admittedly, not a perfect player, and would only create a greater limitation than a benefit. The practical use of this build is the actual fun part. The cadence of how one uses their skills is important but rewarding, and depending on the profile and volume of enemies will warrant how one activates their skills. If outnumbered by a series of mediocre/weak enemies, one would first activate Reboot while remaining offensive if possible. The decoy that is left behind should distract most if not all enemies in range. The decoys aren't perfect after all. During this time, one will consume a relic, and within a 10-second time frame, perform a dodge or slide to keep one's enemies distracted while returning offense. This rope-a-dope process can be repeated for the duration of Reboot. Just prior to the data backup time expiring, it is paramount that one consumes a relic and reactivates the skill. This will dramatically speed up the cooldown time of Reboot. If enemy pressure persists, then one can activate the Hunter's Shroud, which can somewhat mimic the effects of the Invader's Reboot and allow one to take a stick and move offensive tactic, since enemies will have a harder time pinpointing your location while shrouded. By the time the Hunter's Shroud expires, the Reboot skill should be ready, if not close to ready, and one can begin the cycle all over again, due to the Diverting Heart. If facing off against a mixture of weak and tough/elite enemies, then the reverse method is recommended, but not prescribed. Activate the Hunter's Shroud first, and use the window for heightened burst damage to take out either profiles efficiently. Once the Shroud expires, one will switch to Reboot and employ the Relic use and misdirection method as previously described. The Diverting Heart, as a result, will boost the Hunter's Shroud cooldown and allow one to activate it much faster. Provided that a relic is consumed just prior to reactivating Reboot, then one's Reboot skill will cool down quickly while re-employing Hunter's Shroud. There will likely be a few seconds of delay between transitioning from one skill to another, but this onion would consider the wait inconsequential. Lastly, one can use both skills at the same time, and I would reserve this method for bosses or multiple elites that need to be put away quickly and with minimized hiccups. For this to work, one would activate Shroud first, and after the first 10 seconds have passed, activate Reboot and consume a relic. The Hunter's Relic perk, Intuition, will extend their active skill by 10 seconds, though this will degrade with each use. The major benefit is that one will have the damage buff provided by Shroud, while also misdirecting enemies with the Invader's Relic perk, Override, which leaves an empowered decoy for 5.5 seconds. Enemies will be both misdirected and have a far lower chance of paying attention to you. The only downside to this method is that it cannot be repeated like the other two, but instead will only pave a way for using one skill at a time. So offensively, it is the most effective, but will require more patience to use again in the exact same way. This is not to say that one always has to use both skills under these circumstances. Some skirmishes can be ended with a single skill or no skills at all. The important part is having the familiarity of different biomes to be proactive with enemy encounters, and one can employ their skills as they see fit. Now, it is important to mention that one's mods play an important role in the success of these skills and methods of use. I chose Familiar to aid with being outnumbered, especially while trying to use relics under enemy pressure. Scrapshot, on the other hand, will slow enemies and allow one to create more breathing room to properly activate their skills. Sometimes, all one can do is run, especially as a lone target, and the most sensible response is to call on their mods to slow enemy progression or eliminate them altogether. The limitations of this build are not necessarily bad, but I call them limitations because of their demand. As stated earlier, the cadence of one's skills are important to keep them going one after the other, and this will prey on the focus of a given user. Not only does one have to time how they react to enemy attacks, but also keep an eye on the reboot counter / sound effect, correct discretion of consuming a relic, the 10-second window for decoy activation of override, and the timing of Hunter's Shroud. If done properly, one can tease their enemies like an expert matador, even in tight spaces if one knows what they are doing. If done incorrectly, one can be unnecessarily exposed or mistakenly lose out on a bunch of relics. In this Onion's opinion, it takes some getting used to, but is quite rewarding with familiarity. Again, the use of these skills are not prescriptive, but this is the most economical means of playing to the strength of this eternal Spectre. Now I construct these builds with the philosophy of, you can't lose if you don't die. They are ultimately meant to be generally effective enough to have an answer in virtually every circumstance, provided one's skill, or lack thereof, is not the reason for their demise. However, every archetype and pairing will have their fair share of weaknesses based on their natural abilities and the biomes they explore. Now I really had a whole lot of fun using the Invader and Hunter, and like I said, there seems to be a lot of versatility in their potential builds, so chances are we will be revisiting this pairing again in the future, but for the time being, we will stick with the Invader and see what other archetypes we can pull up. Otherwise, that concludes our build for today. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.